This is Climate Curious, the podcast for people who are bored, scared, or confused by climate change.
I'm Maryam, Pasha, the director and curator at TEDxLondon and the co-host of this podcast, alongside the amazing Ben.
Hi, I'm Ben Hurst, activist and advocate exploring what positive masculinities can look like, and self-confessed climate normie.
Hey, Ben.
Hey, hello.
So this is very exciting because this week we're in Oxford University doing a bit of a road show with some of the brainiest people in the world.
Yes. Literally some of the brainiest people in the world.
Yeah.
Not even an exaggeration.
No, it's not. It's not at all. So today we're very excited because we're talking to Australian-born social philosopher Roman Krznaric. Roman's books have focused on the power of ideas to create change and on themes ranging from long-term thinking to the power of empathy. So you and I have seen this, I think, sometimes. We've done, I think, over 100 episodes of this podcast. And sometimes we can, in climate, be always looking to technology and to innovation for the answers. Like, it all lies in the future. But this week, we're actually going to be taking a beat to look in another direction. We're going to delve through the history books and see how it can help us chart a way forward.
History has never been my favourite thing. It's never been
I
my
think it is going to be
favourite
after this
subject
conversation.
in
I think it
school,
is.
So Roman's here to share how we can use history not simply as a means of understanding the past, but also as a way of reimagining our relationship with the future. And he's going to share a radical vision of hope that could turn out to be our most vital tool for surviving and thriving in a world that's affected by climate change. So let's get right into it. Thank you, Roman, for joining us today.
You gave a TED talk a few years ago about being a good ancestor, and that has been hugely popular. You have a new talk that's coming out about history, in a way. And actually, instead of me trying to summarize it and tell you about it, for people who haven't seen the talk, can you give us the headline on the talk?
I guess the headline is the idea that, look, if you were driving a car, you'd never drive without looking in the rear view mirror, you know. And that's the idea of the talk, that if we're going to go forwards and deal with things like the climate emergency or deal with risks from AI, that kind of stuff, we need to actually look in the rear view mirror of history and see what we can learn from the past to help us make decisions today.
It's a good analogy. That's why this guy keeps getting these talks. That's 2 talks, because that is a good analogy. There's a phrase, isn't there, saying if you people, I'm going to get it wrong, but it's something like people who forget the past are damned to repeat it, or something.
Yeah, so those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it.
Right.
But actually, I have the opposite view of that in a sense, because if you think about that idea, those who can't remember the past are condemned to repeat it. That's thinking about history, about the warnings from history, about everything that's gone wrong and learning from that. And of course, I think we need to learn from that. We need to learn from the history of colonialism or the history of high carbon economies and all these things. But I also think that we need to learn from what's gone right as well as what's gone wrong. So when have civilizations managed to deal with problems, manage resources effectively, struggle against injustices and succeed? So I think there's amazing inspiration to be found from the good stuff in history.
So interesting. I think that might be the first time I've ever heard of history being framed as a positive. Like, I feel like actually the subtext of that is that it's always like it went wrong and we need to fix it and we need to do better, rather than like, oh, these are some success stories of how people have actually got it right. Because instantly I start thinking of like Pompeii, and then I'm like, maybe we didn't, maybe there's something to learn here about what not to do. I don't know why. That's just where my mind goes to. No.
And there's something about this that is interesting, because there's this area that I feel like you're carving out, right, between what you've just said, which is history as a warning, and the kind of very toxic nostalgia that people have about the past, right? Because this isn't about that either.
No, absolutely not. I mean, talk to any politician or see any politician speak, and they'll often be referring to the past, often in a completely romantic and nostalgic way. And you often get this around discussions of immigration, where you'll get politicians, particularly on the right, who sort of be telling this kind of story about their own country as if there were never any immigrants in the past, and there's this sort of pure national race. But of course, every country is full of a history of people coming and going, and so politicians have this tendency to construct these historical stories, which are, I think, very romanticized, very nostalgic. And I'm not into that, obviously. I'm trying to draw on what do we actually know from what scholars and researchers have shown us, and stories which often haven't been told. Because when you look at history, we're often told histories of big famous figures, Napoleon, Churchill, Nelson Mandela, whoever it is. But actually, I'm interested in the history of collective action from below. I mean, people organizing in trade unions or in faith groups or in communities, stuff that we've done together to change society.
So my question is, because you've got some great examples, you've got a book on this that's out, but also you've got the TED Talk, and in it you've got some examples, and I want to delve into them and kind of pick apart some of the stuff we didn't get to hear from you in the talk. But before we do that, how did you come across this idea? Like, what brought you to this point to think, this is really important, I need to write a whole book about it?
Yeah, it was a kind of mad enterprise to write a book about the lessons of history because it's just so big and crazy. It partly comes out of a book I wrote before that called The Good Ancestor, How to Think Long-Term in a Short-Term World. And the reason I wrote that book was because I was getting incredibly frustrated with the way our politicians and policymakers were so trapped in the present moment, the tyranny of the now, unable to see beyond the next election or the latest social media post or opinion poll. I think there's not enough long-term thinking because, of course, the decisions we make have huge impacts on the generations to come. Whether it's, whether the airplane flights we take or whatever it happens to be, the food that we eat. But then I started thinking, after I wrote that book, I thought, where can we find the real solutions to that? Because that book was really about why we need to care about future generations, like expanding our moral selves into the future. But when I thought, well, where do we find the solutions? Let's actually look at what we've done so far. Let's not just look at new technologies and hoping that carbon capture and storage or whatever might solve our problems for us. Let's see, have we actually faced any of these problems in the past? So that's where it kind of emerged from. And I ended up, going into vast history around the world over the past 1,000 years, and it did my head in. But after 4 years, I managed to write a book and then do a TED Talk. So I survived.
No.
So did you find that people, is there actually a history of that? Of people like solving problems in the past? Because in my mind, the way that this works is like, this is like an unprecedented problem that's like never happened before. And now we're at a crisis point where we need to solve this problem. But like until this point, everything was just fine. But am I making that up?
I think it's true that a lot of the problems we face today are in some ways different from the ones we faced in the past. It's not like in the 17th century they had societies that were pushing through planetary boundaries of like massive biodiversity loss or CO2 emissions, or they didn't even know that was happening. But they did have certain kinds of problems that they were trying to solve, often together. Like, in the 19th century, trade unions were fighting for, safety at work and the 8-hour day and decent wages and this kind of thing. And it was about people acting together. And again, look today at the global climate movement. It's clear that we need people acting together. Maybe the issue's a little bit different and the policy solutions are a bit different, but the human side of it is the same. It's like, what can we do to cooperate? When does it work? How does it work?
And I want to get into these stories, and you can cut this out because we may not want to include it, and you may not want to tell the story because
you're going to want to tell the story. Definitely going to want to tell the story.
But there was something you told me about an inciting incident that happened at a TED conference that made you think about this. And so I'm just going to ask the question. So obviously, writing The Good Ancestor made you think, kind of, where do we find these solutions? Was there a moment at which it kind of crystallized for you that where you thought, I'm seeing something here that I need to recognize? Actually,
there was a very specific moment. I remember I was at a TED conference in Edinburgh a few years ago, and
we were all there.
Right, we were all there, and up there on the stage was the CEO, the head of Shell, a guy called Ben Van Beurden.
Yeah.
And very slick. He'd been in the oil industry for 38 years, very good at his talking about how Shell was, so advanced in revolutionizing. It was very, very green. And, his children said that he must, make his company more green and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And then when I was listening to him closely, I noticed something because he kept on saying, well, look, we realize that the climate emergency is a big problem, but we can't transform our company too quickly and get off the production of gas and oil too quickly, because otherwise tens of thousands of jobs in Shell will be at stake, and consumers are still dependent on the fossil fuel energy we supply them. So we need to go gradually. So we'll try and be kind of net zero, whatever it was, by 2050. And when I heard that, I thought, oh my God, I've come across this argument before, almost exactly the same thing. 200 years earlier, in the 1820s, slave plantation owners and financiers were making almost exactly the same arguments when it came to the slave economy, because back in the 1820s, over 700,000 enslaved people were working on British-owned sugar plantations in the Caribbean, in the West Indies. And back then, that's exactly when the plantation owners were saying, well, look, we admit that slavery is morally questionable, but let's not end it too quickly, because otherwise our economy, which is so dependent on slavery, may well collapse. So instead, we need to go gradually, and it might take several decades for us to move away from this. And I thought, this is exactly the same foot-dragging arguments made by today's fossil fuel executives that I heard at that TED conference. So suddenly I saw there were these parallels between the past and the present. And there's this other really interesting parallel, which I kind of realized at the time, because in the 1820s, all these arguments were being made about why Britain had to still have these slave plantations and things like that. But then something really interesting happened, because in 1833, there was an Abolition of Slavery Act in Britain, which made plantation slavery illegal. Now, it wasn't perfect by any means. There were reparations or payments made to slave plantation owners for their so-called lost property. And also enslaved people had to keep working for several years as what they called apprentices, which was a kind of forced labor. But there was quite a shift then. But why did it happen? And one of the reasons that explained the timing of the 1833 Act was something that happened in 1831 in Jamaica, which was the Great Jamaica Slave Revolt, when over 20,000 enslaved workers rose up in rebellion. They set fire to over 200 plantations. Now, the revolt was brutally crushed, but it sent a message to the political and economic elite, which was this, that basically the elite started fearing, panicking, that if they didn't give emancipation to the slaves, then they may well lose control of the whole colony of Jamaica. And this tipped the policy context into then having this Abolition of Slavery Act of 1833. And what I realized was that actually, when you think about today's the more radical wing of the climate movement, Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil or Ende Gelände in Germany, these organizations, in a way, they're part of these same disruptive traditions, going back to the slave revolts of the 1830s, or to the suffragettes campaigning for women's votes in the early 20th century, or the movement for Indian independence, or the civil rights movement in the US. They've always been disruptive movements, which have sometimes broken the rules and sometimes the law as well, to create change, to change the conversation. And I think in a way history is so alive when you think about it like that. And, today there's I think nearly 20 people in Britain in prison for, going on climate protests and things like that. And actually they are part of this kind of long tradition of people fighting for justice, now ecological justice. And I think it's a real travesty.
Because right now, the dominant narrative around particularly these kinds of more, let's call them, they're named radical movements, is that they're harming the climate movement, right? That's like the narrative that people want to push, is that
they're taking it too far.
Yeah, taking it too far. They're alienating people. It's not working, etc. But you've not found that in history, right?
Actually, the way it kind of works, I think, is what's called the radical flank effect. Okay, and let me just explain how that works and what it is. So take an example like in the 1960s in the US, where you had the civil rights movement. There were basically two parts to it. You had a more moderate movement around Martin Luther King Jr., who were doing things like sit-ins and strikes. And then you had the more radical wing, the Black Panthers, the Black nationalist ideologies, the Nation of Islam, Malcolm X, people like that. And what that radical flank, it's sometimes called, did was they almost made the mainstream moderate movement look more acceptable by comparison. And that really helped them. So they helped shift the conversation. And I think if you look today at the climate movement, you've got your mainstream organizations, say around something like Friends of the Earth and organizations like that, or the Royal Society of Protection of Birds, all these conservation organizations. And then you've got your more radical organizations like Extinction Rebellion, and their job, as I see it, is that they create the space for the more moderate movement. So they're actually really important. And it's true.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. They do put off some people, right? And has always been the case. You know, when women were campaigning for the vote in Britain 100 years ago, the suffragettes, people hated them. They were called terrorists, right? And they were being put in prison for chaining themselves to fence and breaking windows and things like that. But again, I think a little bit of history helps put it all in perspective. And let me just add another thing here, that you do have to look at the actual evidence. You have to look at the data to see whether the more radical movements today, are they actually converting more people than they're putting off? And there's really good evidence emerging of just how many people are starting to put the climate higher up their list of political priorities because of what these movements are doing. And yeah, they do upset some people. So the evidence suggests that the more radical movements, well, they do put off some people, they convert lots of people. And then I've also found myself like lying on the street, blocking the road in front of Parliament in London with my teenage daughter, because I'm just exasperated by the government's lack of action, the glacial pace of change. And to be honest, I can't think of a better way to be a good ancestor. I know blocking the road annoys commuters, but our inaction is going to infuriate future generations even more. And so, you know, I like spending most of my time in old libraries reading books and stuff, but because of what I've discovered in those books about the power of the more radical flank movements, that's why I found myself, you know, giving a bit of support.
This is incredibly interesting, because the place my brain goes to is like, what's the decision-making criteria for whether you, like, which side of the movement you join, you know, like how do you reach the decision? But I guess you've just outlined that, like, when the frustration grows too large, then it's time to start doing something. But how did you decide, like, between research or laying in the road?
I mean, I think it's really important to recognize that we can all play different kinds of roles, and many roles need to be played. There need to be people inside the system, you know, lobbying politicians. There need to be people in the media doing podcasts, you know, like yourselves. There need to be people writing books, you know, like I do. And there also need to be people on the streets. And I think for any one of us, there'll always probably be a place that feels more right than some other place.
Yeah.
I found myself sort of shifting a little bit, you know. Obviously, I spend most of my time writing books, but I found myself more on the streets than I ever thought that I would. And I think it's because the political situation is changing. Although there's lots of good stuff happening, you know, the price of solar is going down and all those kinds of things. Governments, though, are in many ways becoming, you know, closing down the place for voices of protest about the ecological emergency.
So, okay, let's think about, because we've talked about the abolitionist movement as one of the examples in history that you saw. Another one that you talk about that I find very interesting is around, and particularly relevant for this podcast, I think, is around cities and the role that cities played in bringing together different groups of people. And I think in climate, this is particularly relevant because we know that there's going to be climate-driven or climate-related migration, and I have to say that, like, my background is in migration, and I find the way that we talk about it in the climate movement terrible. In the migration and the rights-based migration movement, we've spent decades trying to get people to not fear migration and not see it as a bad thing, but to actually see it as the thing that it factually is, which is contributing to society. Right. And unfortunately, in the climate environmental movement, it's used as a stick. Like if you don't do something, floods of people are going to come.
There's going to be a billion climate refugees by 2050.
Exactly.
How are we going to survive? Yeah.
And so we're playing into a narrative that's very dangerous for all of us, which is this isolationist, xenophobic, racist narrative. But I think you talked about it in the talk as well, that there are great examples of cities and diversity, and actually that maybe there is something there for us to actually learn from, as we inevitably have people who will be forced or choose to move due to the impacts of climate change.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we kind of have a bit of a narrative of an inevitable clash of civilizations, you know, that You know, that
it's come back into vogue at the moment.
It's come back into vogue that, you know, the West and Islam or whatever can never live together and
coexist.
They cannot coexist. But actually, the amazing thing, if you look through history, you can find these periods of time where people have managed to live together in cultures of relevant, you know, tolerance. So if I was going to go back to any moment in history, I would travel back in my Doctor Who time machine to about the year 1000 in the Spanish city of Cordoba, which at that time was part of the Islamic kingdom of Al-Andalus, which ruled over the southern part of today's Spain. Right? And the amazing thing about Cordoba then is it was a big city, like nearly 500,000 people. So one of the biggest cities in Europe at the time. Because often, you know, we think about medieval times, we think of like, you know, Game of Thrones and, you know, people killing each other with axes and knights and so on. But,
people to death,
but actually, go back 1,000 years to the south of Spain, in Cordoba, you basically had a civilization in a big city where Muslims, Christians and Jews managed to live side by side. Now, it wasn't perfect. There were everyday tensions. There were outbreaks of violence occasionally. But basically, people managed to get on. They would be trading together in the marketplaces, going to public bathhouses together, playing chess and music together. And I think this says something about how cities are really actually a brilliant technology, in a way, a social technology. They're really good at mixing people together. You know, not perfectly by any means. Of course, go to the barrios of East LA or something like that and look at the racist policing. Of course, they're not perfect. But actually, if you want to get people of different backgrounds to get on with each other, put them together in a city, you know, and over time, again, not perfectly, they will start mixing together, you know, whether it's kids playing in football teams together with people from different backgrounds or people you go to work with or you meet in the cafe, all these kinds of things are creating what it's sometimes called, or putting into practice what psychologists sometimes call the contact hypothesis. And this is the idea that if you want to build empathy, tolerance, mutual respect, you basically put people together from different backgrounds in conditions of relative equality and get them to do stuff together. You know, that could be being in a football team together. And there's amazing evidence in social psychology showing that in about over 90% of the time, when you do that, people do build tolerance rather than build more animosity and conflict. So, you know, this is where cities are really, really cool, I think, actually really important places of tolerance building.
You know what it is, though, that's interesting about all the ways that you've drawn these lessons into the present is that they are very local ways that you are implementing them. And I think that there's definitely a misconception that in order to have an impact, make change, do things, that you have to be big. Like it doesn't matter unless it's like changing the law or I don't know, something massive, you know, something at a national level. And actually what I'm hearing is that lots of these building blocks are local.
I totally agree with that. And I mean, if you look at it around the world, where have you seen the most progress on dealing with the climate emergency? You've seen it on the level of communities and cities. You look at a city like Paris, which is saying, right, by 2030, no more fossil fuel cars, or you've got new traffic regulations, you know, in lots of cities in the UK and other places, you know, where, you know, they're stopping cars coming through, this kind of thing. And it happens through local action. You know, actually, I think, you know, people acting in their own communities can make a huge difference. And they create a model which can then be copied in other cities and places around the world. So it's a kind of peer-to-peer inspiration model. So I think everything that we do on that local level, particularly when we do it with others, not just changing a light bulb in your house, you know, but changing the light bulbs in the local school, you know, that can really make a big difference.
You mentioned earlier, right, that idea of like the stories that we get told about history and how it works is it's always about the individual who made the big change rather than the community that mobilized for that change to be possible. So maybe, I don't know, I just have this sense of like, am I just taking the easy road out? Because I don't want to lay down in the road, you know? Like,
I mean, I think to be honest, I think
stuff.
some people have to be making the sacrifices. You know, there are people that need to lie in the road. But, you know, even my experience which is not huge, of going on, climate protests and stuff like that and blocking roads a little bit, is actually, it's quite enjoyable in the sense of you feel like you're part of a community, you're part of a kind of a tribe, and you feel that solidarity with people, often strangers, very different age groups. I remember one of the first times I went on a climate change march, I met this woman who was a grandmother, and she had a little kind of brooch around her neck. It was a photograph of her granddaughter. And she said, I'm here for my granddaughter who's like 2 or 3 years old. And just, to feel that you're connected with someone from another generation. Yeah. That's quite a beautiful thing. Yeah. I think in a way, being an activist in various forms, you have to sort of be ready to feel the whole landscape of the emotions. Right. You will feel like frustration that you're not making much difference. Then you also feel joy at meeting people, and sometimes there'll be a win. But I think that's just kind of life. Yeah.
It's also, it takes you out of the isolation, because I think, so I've been trying to wrap my head around what's been happening the last few days in America. And and one of the most insightful things I've read about it is that it is supposed to feel overwhelming. Like, it's a tactic. It's a deliberate strategy, is to make you feel so overwhelmed that you just think, I can't do anything.
Exactly right. And the Canadian writer Naomi Klein called this the shock doctrine. And the idea of the shock doctrine is that what you see in the last 20, 30 years is you've got these extremist political and economic elites trying to push through very radical policies, often very right-wing policies. And the way they do it is they flood the media and stuff with a whole load of policies with crazy pronouncements, and they create a sense of crisis, and then they make a kind of smoke screen. They bamboozle you to push through the policies that they really want. And this is exactly what Trump has done. 37 executive orders in the first week, then saying we need to clear out Gaza, we're going to take back the Panama Canal, we're going to put all these tariffs on everybody. And behind that smokescreen, he can do things like withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord, or give pardons to 1,500 people who attacked the Capitol building in 2021, and do these things which are actually quite extreme measures, but that chaos that's going on allows them to do it. It's that shock and awe strategy. So I think you're absolutely right, Maryam.
So I think this, what you're saying actually, is about the only way to overcome that is to feel in community. Like, is to be with others, is to feel a sense of even if it's like just not being alone. Because I think the loneliness is probably one of the things that is really affecting people. Is that the when it feels so overwhelming, you just retreat, and you can't. And if you've gone on these marches, or you have a movement, or you have your street fair, or you have your football club, you don't retreat because you have a place to go. And I think that actually is quite radical.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think it taps into something really amazing about human beings, which is that we are social animals. We are wired for empathy and social cooperation and mutual aid. We are homo empathicus. And, we actually get meaning from being with other people. If I think about what does a meaningful life look like, or how can we be happy? I think it's partly we need a sense of autonomy. I think we need that. I think we need a sense of kind of purpose, something bigger than ourselves that we aim for in life. But the third thing, I think we need relationships, and that could be in family, but extending that out, I think, is something that we're actually really, really good at.
I meant to ask you also, I read something about an empathy museum, but I don't know what an empathy museum is.
I can tell you.
Please,
because I founded one.
Please do.
Yeah. So I founded this museum back in 2015. It's called the Empathy Museum. And it's all about giving people the experience of how to step into the shoes of other people and look at the world through their eyes. And so one of the exhibits that we have, and by the way, I'm just the chair of the board now. It's run by proper artists. Right. I'm just a philosopher.
You are a proper artist as well.
I don't know. But so one of our exhibits is called A Mile in My Shoes. And it's a gigantic shoebox which travels around the world, and you can actually go inside it. And it looks like a shoebox, and it's the world's first empathy museum. So you go inside and someone will fit you with a pair of shoes belonging to a stranger. So it could be the shoes of a Syrian refugee, or an ecological activist, or a Buddhist monk. And you can literally walk a mile in their shoes while listening to an audio narrative of them talking about their own lives in their own words. So we recently curated a whole bunch of stories on the theme of migration. So we had different kinds of stories of migration. We've curated stories around climate. In fact, we're just planning now to go to COP30, big climate meeting in Brazil next year, and collect news stories from the Amazon. Because wherever we go with the shoebox, we collect news, shoes, and stories. So we've got hundreds and hundreds of pairs. And think about it, it's kind of intimate and it's kind of fun, because you go along and you put on a pair of shoes. You might put on the shoes of a Syrian refugee, and you think you don't know what you're going to expect, because all you know is the size of the shoes. You don't know the name of the person or anything about them. But then often the stories are often surprising. So the story of a refugee might actually be hilarious. It might be really funny, and you might think it's going to be tragic, but not. And I think that's part of showing the variety of human experience. And so the purpose of the Empathy Museum is to try and create this kind of asabiya, this collective solidarity, knit our societies together again.
Do you give people new shoes, or do you just take the shoes and...
No, we've got... No, if you were part of this project and your story was being recorded, we would have a pair of your actual shoes.
You donate
You donate your shoes
them,
into the collection, and they stay there forever. So you'd have to lose that pair of shoes.
I'm not sure if
Come on.
No,
you must have a pair of shoes. You've got beautiful kind of
a nice
round
Uggs on,
Uggs on.
Well, since we are talking about clothing, since we have gone there, I think we're going to have to ask you about your jacket. Because obviously, if those of you listening cannot see this, but Roman is wearing a very cool jacket, which you can see if you watch his TED Talk. So you can go there. But tell us about this jacket you're wearing.
So the jacket I'm wearing is, you may not realize this, a cure for consumer capitalism. I probably better explain
Sounds
that.
like a cure for me.
Better explain it. So, look, when I go to my local shopping center, right, and I see people just buying stuff and basically using energy or creating carbon emissions, all these kinds of things, also having a good time, I thought, you sort of think, this system, we could never change this, you know, like our addiction to Black Friday shopping sprees and things like that. But actually, if you look through history, there are whole societies that have done large-scale ways of actually running their economies totally differently, much more low carbon, much more ecological. And this links to the jacket, and I'll tell you why. Because if you go back to Japan, right, in the 18th century, to the ancient Japanese city of Edo, which is now called Tokyo, right? Now, that was a city of over 1 million people, so a huge city, but they also had something amazing going on. They also operated what we would today call a circular economy, where they would reuse, repurpose, recycle almost all of their materials. So they would reuse, repurpose, and recycle almost all of their materials, partly because at the time Japan didn't trade a lot with the outside world. Right. So they had shortages of things
like... when the borders were still closed?
Yeah, borders were closed, right, exactly. So they had shortages of wood, shortages of cotton. And so a tradition of patchwork developed, known as boro, meaning tattered rags, where fragments of old cloth would be sewn together into garments, which were then passed on down the generation. So what I'm wearing is a traditional Japanese boro jacket, which is over 100 years old. And as you can see, it's been stitched together out of lots of bits of cotton cloth. And this is the circular economy of ancient Japan that I'm wearing. And I think we need to be doing more of this today.
Yeah. I mean, what's interesting is that you talked about this in your talk, that these cloths would have like a whole lifespan, right? They would be used in so many different ways.
Right, yeah. So you might have a kimono as well, and you'd use it until the cloth began to wear out. And then you turn that cloth into nappies, into like pajamas that you wear at night. Then you'd cut it up and turn it into nappies. Then you'd use it as cleaning cloths, and you'd finally burn that precious cotton cloth as fuel. So nothing was ever wasted. Or there were people in Edo, ancient Tokyo, who would go around collecting used candle wax to form it back into candles. Well, people would even come and collect human waste from your home, pay you for it, and then sell it as agricultural fertilizer. So nothing went to waste.
And this was not a small city, right?
No, this was mad. There were thousands of these businesses, over 1 million people in Tokyo, Edo at the time. So, when people sort of say, we can't, or they sort of say, we can't sort of transform our economies, it's too difficult. Actually, in the past, we've done it at a really big scale. And look, all I'm not saying we should be like ancient Japan exactly, because they did have feudalism,
which is maybe not the best.
And patriarchy and, peasant poverty and all that kind of stuff. But I think it just sort of opens up our imaginations to a different way of doing things. And I think that's the beauty and value of history, is sort of saying like, God, maybe it doesn't have to be this way. You can look around at the world that we're in today and say, like, maybe it doesn't have to be this. Maybe we don't have to have these gigantic fossil fuel companies or big tech companies dominating everything. Maybe there's another way of doing things, because actually, I'm not making this up.
Yeah.
There's history saying that it could be a bit different.
Exists. Yeah. You just got to
I just find that
up.
really inspiring, that actually we used to do things differently. And the things like this jacket I'm wearing, this Bordeaux jacket, if you talk to your grandparents or something, you know, let's say they were still alive in the Second World War, you know, which they may have been, they might remember how people would not waste clothing, or not waste food. So I think all of these things are in our own families too. And I think it's really important to sort of dig where you stand, to dig into your own personal history. Yeah, it's great to learn about the history of ancient Japan, but actually look in the history of your own community or faith tradition or your own family. You can find lessons for history too.
Yeah.
And I think that's really empowering. You know, history connects to all of us. We're all inheritors of the past.
We've talked about so many different examples. They're amazing. I want to ask you, is there something that you found in all of this research that we haven't talked about yet? Because I'm sure these are some of your favorite, where you were like, oh, I can't believe I found this. This is incredible. This is like a real nugget that I want people to know.
Yeah, I found loads of those nuggets. Maybe that's because I'm incredibly ignorant. I kept being like shocked. I thought like, why the hell didn't I know that?
Yeah.
Okay. So
I thought I invented that idea.
So, yeah. So like, here's an example. So like, I don't know about you, but I look at our democracies today and think like, our political systems are just not very good at dealing with like a long-term problem like the ecological crisis, for example, or even not delivering on basic things like job security and housing for people. And no wonder so many people turn against the traditional parties, right? And when I was looking at, I was thinking about, look, is there any better way of doing democracy? I don't want to go down the route of authoritarianism and have live in a military dictatorship, but can we do democracy differently than just like putting an X on a ballot sheet every few years? And then I started reading, for example, about how in the 19th century, when British colonial forces went into the lands of Igbo communities in today's Nigeria, they were looking for, they were trying to find the chiefs or the kings. And they couldn't find any. They assumed that their politics was hierarchically, vertically kind of organized. But in fact, what Igbo communities did, the way they governed themselves was through very local democracy, where most decisions were made in the village level, with men and women participating, deliberating, talking together, coming to decisions by consensus. And then if they had to make decisions for a regional level, they kind of send delegates up, like have councils of elders making decisions. And it wasn't only in the 19th century in Nigeria, Igbo community did that. Even in Europe as well. There were lots of examples of this kind of grassroots communal decision-making. Or go back to ancient Greece, right? They had what today we call sortition, which is the random selection of people for public office. Like we do for juries today, you used to get randomly selected for that. But in ancient Greece, which was not a perfect democracy by any means in the 4th and 5th century BC, because they, no voting rights for women or for slaves or for immigrants, but serious limitations, but for the male citizens, they were randomly selected for the equivalent of the Parliament, of the House of Commons. It was called the Council of 500, right? And just imagine if we did that today, where our politicians were just everyday citizens, randomly selected. And the amazing thing is that this is happening today in the citizens' assembly movement. You might know, like, over the last 10 years, across Europe particularly, there have been over 300 of these citizens' assemblies where governments have wanted an issue to be discussed, whether it's climate or the risks of AI or an aging population, and they select maybe like 100 random citizens controlled for gender and ethnic background and age, and then they get them to meet up and discuss an issue. And one of the things we found is that particularly around climate issues, that citizens tend to have much more transformative ideas of what policy should be implemented compared to your regular politicians. And this is really just a kind of an old form of democracy going on, which is much more direct and participatory. And because, the idea, if you go to your local election, but the ballot sheet every few years, just putting an X down, is that really what being a citizen is all about? Surely we can do better than that. And there are all these examples from the past that we can draw on to say, hey, let's try and involve people more directly. Let's give people a feeling of agency and choice, a sense that like, I can make a difference. My voice actually matters. Someone's listening to me. And I think this is also really important to deal with extremism, because I think a lot of people who support, like, for example, the far right populist parties in Britain, in Europe, I think a lot of those people don't feel heard.
Right.
Yes.
And I think a citizens' assembly is a way for people to be heard. People are not always going to agree with each other.
Yeah.
But actually what citizens do, they kind of take off the sharp edges.
Yeah.
Right.
And help people find common ground. So unfortunately, I didn't have time to talk about this in this TED Talk, but actually history is really important for helping us rethink democracy. And you got a podcast about being climate curious. Well, if you're curious about how to deal with the climate crisis, you also need to think about how you're going to change the politics.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because, if we're keeping these short-term political cycles, we ain't going to get anywhere, really. It's going to be really tough. So we need to redesign democracy.
This is so... Do you know what I was literally just thinking? I was like, I wish there was a book where I could read about all of this stuff. And you literally...
Boom!
This is great!
And I have to say, the book is called History for Tomorrow. I've read it. And I'll tell you the feeling I had when I read it. This is before the first time we got to really talk about it, Roman, was that feeling I was saying you get in community where you feel less alone and less overwhelmed. That's the feeling you get when you read this book. Because all of a sudden you think, well, these people figured stuff out. And they probably felt very overwhelmed by their problems at their time, because whenever you go in history, people were dealing with things that for them were big,
the biggest,
right? Even if for us they don't seem the same way, and they figured out solutions. They found ways forward. They did things that worked. So maybe we have it in us to do it as well.
Yeah, and I think what I learned from writing that book was the power of two tiny words: as if. Let me explain what I mean. If you look at those who struggled against the odds, people like those who were campaigning for independence from British-controlled India, they probably thought, God, we're never going to succeed here. But they acted as if change was possible, as if they could succeed. And so I'm not saying that changing the world is easy. It's not, right? It's not. But we have managed to make progress and create cities and civilizations, tackle injustices, often against the odds. And it's been, I think, largely through acting as if you could make change. And so that's where I find hope, in those two tiny little words.
And now it's time for our climate confessions. Let's fess up to the bad habits we just can't kick.
You don't have to be perfect and do everything right to be part of the climate movement, although sometimes that's what it can feel like. So, Ben, I'm going to start with you so that you can kind of ease us into it. Do you have a climate confession?
Oh yeah. So now that I've learned about this jacket, this 120-year-old jacket, clothing waste has got to be a big thing for me, because I don't reuse anything. I do wear things for long periods of time. But
you wash them in between.
I wash them. Yeah, fingers
Just
crossed.
checking.
When I can, But I've got like vacuum packed bags of clothing in my loft that have been up there for a long time now, that I just have no intention of revisiting. I would buy new things before I reuse any of those items of clothing, so much so that I don't even know actually what's in there. But now maybe there's a way that I can repurpose some of those things into new stylish and fashionable garments. So I'd say my clothing waste is probably a little bit out of control at the moment, especially with boxers. Underwear is like...
we've been through this.
Yeah, it's just too much. And now I can use them as rags for other things. Or maybe, is it okay to burn them?
No burning.
Fuel? Don't burn them as fuel.
No, not today.
My next episode's confession is going to be that I've been burning my underwear. But yeah,
that could really catch on, actually.
Yeah.
Clothing waste.
And we'll try and look it up. But I know there's one, not in the UK, but I know there's a really amazing place in LA, and the name of it has slipped my mind, where they take clothes and rework them into new items, because a lot of times the stuff you give to charity shops is just not usable in and of itself.
This is trash.
But if you take it there, they'll actually cut it up and make stuff from it.
Well, one really cool one I heard about recently, there's this Swedish sportswear company called Houdini, and they have totally like recyclable clothes. And one of the things they've done is that when you've grown out of your Houdini hiking jacket, you can give it to them. They put it in a skip, and then it like disintegrates and turns back into soil. And then they've served meals to their customers made out of their old sports clothes.
Oh, I love it.
What the meal is fertilized by the
So they grow the vegetables in the soil, which is being made from their jackets. Sorry, I didn't quite get that right.
It's okay, we got it. I got it.
Did you get it?
Yeah, we got it.
So like basically eat your clothes.
It's brilliant. I like that.
That is my
We should go have
confession.
one of
I've
those
not been
lunch.
eating my clothes. Yeah, we should go to Houdini. Yeah.
Do you have a climate confession?
God, I have millions of climate confessions. Okay, what's the most recent one? Okay, the other day. So I'm a vegetarian, right? I've been on this long journey, knowing that if I look at all the statistics, I know that going towards being plant-based is good for the planet. Right? It's one of the most obvious things we can do. So actually, it's turning into a slightly longer story. I wasn't going to say this, but I'll just tell you it anyway. So, I mean, it's not that interesting. But so the first time I tried to go vegetarian, right, I just didn't do it very well because the food that I made just wasn't as good as the meat that I used to eat.
Delicious,
Right.
yeah.
It wasn't delicious. I was feeling kind of weak and pathetic. And so I gave up. I went back to eating meat again. And then the next time I tried to go vegetarian, I actually thought, I'm going to make better food than I used to. And in fact, that's where I am now. So I put a little bit more effort into my cooking to make amazing things with tofu or with peas or with, whatever it happens to be. And I try and feed my kids better food. Now, I haven't yet gone vegan, right? So I'm on that journey. But anyway, this is what I wanted to tell you. So I was walking down the street around the corner from here the other day, and I always go and get a falafel wrap, vegetarian falafel wrap for lunch. And so I went to this kebab shop, and I was feeling really knackered. I'd gone to bed really late. I hadn't slept well. I was just kind of feeling, I don't know, like I needed a kind of boost. And I went in there, and I went to the kebab shop, right? And I was about to order my falafel wrap, and suddenly I saw this turning thing of like chicken on a meat on a skewer, like probably really dodgy. I don't know, but I looked at that and just thought, and there was like these like fat dripping off it and stuff like that. I thought to myself, I want that.
I need it.
I need it. So I ordered this chicken kebab roll thing, and it was so delicious. Like it was so.
Did it not make you really sick?
It was a little bit weird in my stomach,
Yeah.
but at the time it tasted really, really good. and I was walking back, eating back, and thinking like, I need to finish eating this before I get home.
Oh yeah.
So that like nobody sees me. And in fact, nobody actually knows I've eaten that chicken kebab. Not even my kids or my wife or anybody. So I'm saying it here for the first time.
We're going to send this episode to them.
I was going to say we won't tell.
To the end. See if they listen all the way to the end. That's brilliant. You know what, though?
The thing, the way I look at it, like with this food stuff, is I don't think you've got to be puritanical. I think that works for some people. I think it's about being really mindful, And
I think that's really good advice, what you just said about making food that's more delicious if you're going to change something.
Yeah, I think this is really important for climate change stuff in general. Like, for example, like if your city is going to say, look, we're banning fossil fuel cars going into it, and that'll upset a lot of people who maybe drive a car. But what you've got to do is put something better in its place, like better public transport or even free public transport and trams and buses and things like that. And I think on the individual level too, if you're going to make the change, let's make it better.
I agree. I agree. I had the other day for the first time a coffee with pea milk, like milk made from peas.
Oh, wow.
I don't know. I said, that sounds delicious. That doesn't sound delicious.
It was delicious. It was delicious. And I thought, another kind of milk I've discovered. I think sometimes it's also just being like, I'm going to try it, and
Willing
it's
to
okay if
try.
I hate it.
Yeah, I think peas are the secret food of the future. My wife's favorite food is peas. She once dressed up as a pea for a fancy dress thing.
I'm
As
coming
a
around to
princess and the
peas.
pea. She was the pea.
I'm coming around to peas.
I'm not big into peas. I'm on the journey towards peadom.
Try this pea milk if you can.
Okay,
They need
pea
to find
milk.
a better name for it because it just doesn't
I'm
work.
not going to try that. I don't think.
I'm going to
but-
find it for you, and I'm going to get you
I don't know if you
a.
need to do that, actually.
I do not have a climate confession this week, but I'm going to give one from our team, and I'm not going to mention who it is because she hasn't consented. But
She? Who is it?
our whole team has she
that's fair, yeah.
pronouns, so it doesn't really. She told us this, and actually our producer Josie told me, and I think it's great that I don't know who this is. You know who this is.
You know who you are.
Every time she hates doing laundry, so every time she has new guests in the house, she buys new sheets.
No, that's But that's expensive.
I know.
What does she do when there's not new guests in the house?
She just uses the sheets she has. But when she has guests in and she wants to change it, I don't know. You're going to have to ask
The ins
her.
and outs. Okay,
these
right. No problem.
But it comes along the lines of your clothing. So
Yeah, same
she's
thing.
got a lot of rags that she could use.
New sheets,
I think you
new
could team up
underwear.
with this person.
Yeah. We could trade something. We'll figure it out.
We'll figure it out. Next episode, we'll come back to you. Roman, it is such a
so
pleasure to
much.
chat with you.
Yeah. Honestly.
This is, I think, a conversation that a lot of people need right now.
Yeah.
And it's just been a privilege to have it in your home.
I feel
Well,
so
thank
inspired.
you. Thank you. And I'm shocked that I made my kebab confession. But there's,
We bring
you're
out
obviously
people.
brilliant interviewers.
Yeah, no.
Somehow you made me say something I'd never said before and I was going to keep to myself to the grave.
It's for a better future. Don't worry. We're collective transformation.
Please do yourself a favor. Listen to Roman's talk. Read his many books.
Yeah.
And remember,
Stay curious. Thank you for joining us this week. We really hope you enjoyed this episode.
if you did, please hit the follow button to make sure you get next week's release.
We are now officially crowdsourcing Climate Confession, so please leave yours in the ratings and the reviews section, and we'll shout out for you next time. And shout out to our fabulous team behind the pod.
This episode was produced by Josie Colter, artwork designed by Rebecca Mingus,
Curation by Maryam Pasha.
mixed and engineered by Ben Beheshty,
Music also by Ben Beheshty
presented by Ben Hurst.
and Maryam Pasha. Remember, stay curious.